your name on his phone. Please, it's not what you think. Then why are you crying instead of answering? Because the truth will destroy us both. Destroy us both? What have you done? I didn't betray you the way you think I did. Then whose messages are these? If you read the last one, you'll never look at our family the same way again.
Eleanor Voss had agreed to be her sister for exactly 24 hours. She had not agreed to become the person who found out her sister's marriage was a lie. She was standing in a kitchen that was not her own, in a house that smelled faintly of lavender polish and old money, wearing a cream silk blouse that fit her the way it always fit Margot, which is to say perfectly, effortlessly, as though it had been sewn for a body that had never once doubted its place in the world. Her hands were not shaking yet. That would come later. Right now they were simply still, resting against the marble countertop, her fingers curled loosely around a phone that was not hers. A phone she had picked up out of nothing more than habit. The same reflex that made her answer any ringing thing within reach. The same reflex that had made her spend her whole life answering for people who never quite finished answering for themselves. The kitchen around her had the particular hush of a room built for entertaining rather than living in. A hush that only settles once the guests have finally drifted elsewhere and the staff have retreated to whatever quiet corner they occupy between courses. The countertops were the kind of pale gray marble that photographs beautifully and shows every fingerprint if you actually use it, veined faintly like something out of a museum. And above the stove hung a row of copper pots Eleanor felt certain had never once touched a flame. She noticed these details the way she noticed most things, quietly, without commentary, filing them away in the same part of her mind that had spent 34 years cataloging the differences between the life her sister had built and the one she herself had settled into without ever quite deciding to settle. The screen was lit. That was all. A small rectangle of light in an otherwise quiet kitchen, and on it, a message from a name saved simply as a single letter, the kind of shorthand people use when they are hiding something they have already decided to keep hiding. Eleanor read it once, and told herself she had misunderstood it. She read it a second time, slower now, the way a person rereads a sentence they are hoping will rearrange itself into something less true. It did not rearrange itself. It sat there, plain and certain, saying something no husband says to a woman who is only his wife, something no sister ever wants to find on a screen that was never meant to be seen by anyone standing in that kitchen at all, least of all by the one person in the world who trusted Margot enough to become her for a single day. Her thumb hovered over the screen without quite touching it, the way a person hovers a hand over a stove they suspect, but do not yet know for certain, is still hot. She had never once, in 34 years, gone looking through her sister's private life uninvited. This was different. This had come to her, lit up and waiting on a counter, in a house she had been trusted to stand inside of for exactly one day. And there was something almost unbearable in the unfairness of that timing, the particular cruelty of a secret choosing to surface on the one day it belonged to someone else to carry. Outside, the late afternoon light had gone the particular gold color it turns right before it starts to fail, slanting low through the windows of a house Eleanor had visited perhaps a dozen times in her entire life, always as a guest, always aware in some quiet corner of herself that this was Margot's world and not her own, built from choices Eleanor had never made and never wanted to make, right up until the moment she had said yes to borrowing it for one afternoon. Somewhere beyond that window, a gala was still going on without her, string lights strung across a lawn she could see from where she stood, laughter drifting up faint and distant, the particular sound of people who have no idea that 50 feet away, inside a warm kitchen, an entire marriage has just quietly come apart in the hands of the wrong woman. She could hear, faintly, the low murmur of a string quartet still working through the last movements of something she did not recognize, punctuated every so often by a ripple of laughter that reached her through the glass, like something happening underwater, muffled and far away. A part of her wanted, badly, to walk back out into that laughter and pretend the last several minutes had not happened at all, to simply become Margot again for however many hours remained of this favor, smiling at strangers, accepting compliments that belonged to someone else. But her feet did not move. She stood exactly where she was, in her sister's kitchen, in her sister's blouse, holding her sister's undoing in the palm of one hand. Eleanor did not remember deciding to sit down. She simply became aware, several long seconds later, that she was sitting, that the phone was still in her hand, that her breath had gone thin and careful the way it does when a person is trying very hard not to make a sound. 24 hours. That was all this was supposed to cost her. 24 hours of smiling at people who thought she was someone else. 24 hours of laughing at jokes meant for her sister. 24 hours of standing in for a woman who had asked her, the way she always asked, with just enough vulnerability in her voice to make refusal feel cruel. Eleanor had said yes the way she had said yes her entire life, without asking the one question she should have asked before agreeing to become someone else for even a single day, which was simply this. What exactly am I being asked to stand inside of? She thought, briefly and almost involuntarily, of every other time she had said yes without asking that question first. A lifetime of small surrenders stacked so evenly on top of one another that she had stopped noticing the weight of them individually, noticing only, now and then, in moments like this one, how heavy they had all become together. She thought, in that first frozen minute, of her own kitchen 3 towns over, where her husband was almost certainly making dinner slightly wrong in the specific way he always made it slightly wrong, where her daughter was probably doing homework at the table with her socked feet pulled up onto the chair the way she was told 100 times not to do, where nothing, as far as Eleanor knew, had gone wrong yet. She thought of how ordinary that kitchen would feel right now compared to this one. She thought of how she had left that ordinary kitchen willingly that morning, walked out the door in her own clothes, and had not yet fully understood, standing there in her sister's blouse with her sister's phone lit up in her hand, that she was about to walk back into it a different woman than the one who left it. For one long moment, she allowed herself to imagine simply putting the phone down, walking out the side door, and driving home without waiting for Margot to return at all, letting her sister discover on her own, whenever she finally came back, that the truth had surfaced without any help from Eleanor. But even as she imagined it, she understood it was never really something she would do, not because she wasn't angry, not because some part of her wasn't already grieving something she couldn't yet name, but because leaving would mean abandoning the one habit that had defined her entire life. And Eleanor Voss, whatever else this night would end up costing her, was not yet ready to become a woman who walked away from someone who needed her, even when that someone had never once asked whether Eleanor needed anything in return. Before we go any further into what Eleanor found in that kitchen and everything it would cost her to carry it, let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand exactly what Eleanor was holding in her hands that afternoon, and exactly how much it would eventually cost her, it helps to go back to the very beginning, to a hospital room in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio, 34 years earlier, where 2 identical girls were born 11 minutes apart, and where a tired young mother named Ruth Whitfield made a decision in the first exhausted hour of their lives that she would spend the next 3 decades quietly, invisibly, trying to undo. Ruth Whitfield had been 26 years old the night her daughters were born, married just under 2 years to a man named Everett who worked long shifts at the regional freight yard and who had wanted, more than anything else in his life up to that point, a single healthy child. He had gotten 2 instead, and Ruth remembered, even decades later, the particular look on his face in the hallway outside the delivery room, somewhere between joy and a kind of quiet arithmetic terror, the specific expression of a young father already calculating, without meaning to, how far one paycheck would need to stretch to cover 2 of everything. The nurse who handed Ruth her daughters that first evening said the same thing every nurse says to a mother of twins, that she would learn to tell them apart within days, that no two children, however identical their faces, ever really felt the same in a mother's arms. Ruth remembered nodding at the time, exhausted past the point of speech, and she remembered believing it, right up until the moment she actually held them, one in each arm, and felt the small, quiet, shameful truth settle into her chest before she had any language for it at all. One of them had cried the entire first night, a thin, insistent, unrelenting sound that pulled at something instinctive in Ruth and would not let go. The other had simply watched her, wide-eyed and strangely calm, as though she had already decided, in her first hours of life, that crying was not going to be how she got her needs met in this family. Ruth spent that whole night holding the crying one. She would spend, without ever quite admitting it to herself, the next 3 decades doing the same thing in 100 smaller ways, and the calm one grew up to be Eleanor. There is a photograph, still kept in a drawer in Ruth's house to this day, taken when the twins were perhaps 4 years old, both girls in matching yellow dresses sewn by a neighbor who did that kind of work for extra money, standing in front of a chain-link fence in a backyard long since sold to different owners. In the photograph, Margot is mid-laugh, caught in the exact instant of some joke or tumble no one now remembers, her whole small body thrown into the moment. Eleanor stands half a step behind her, watching her sister rather than the camera, a faint, careful smile on her face, the smile of a child who has already learned that the best place to stand in most family photographs is just slightly out of the center of them. Margot was the one who cried that first night, and Margot remained, for the whole of their childhood, the daughter whose feelings arrived first and loudest, whose scraped knees seemed to hurt more, whose disappointments seemed to matter more urgently, whose successes were celebrated a half-degree louder at the dinner table, not because Ruth loved her more, she would have said if anyone had ever asked her directly, but because Margot made herself impossible to overlook, and Eleanor, from her very first hours of life, had made herself remarkably easy to. There is a particular kind of love that quiet children learn to survive on, a love made almost entirely of trust rather than attention, the unspoken assumption that because a child causes no trouble, she must need very little looking after, and Eleanor grew up fluent in that kind of love the way other children grow up fluent in a language spoken only at home, without ever quite realizing how much it had shaped the woman she would become. Everett died when the girls were 9. A heart attack at the freight yard on an ordinary Thursday that left no time for goodbyes or last words. Only a phone call Ruth received at the kitchen sink and a silence afterward that swallowed the whole house for months. It was Eleanor, even at 9 years old, who remembered handing her mother tissues without being asked, who remembered quietly finishing Margot's homework at the kitchen table some nights, when her sister simply could not make herself sit still with grief long enough to hold a pencil, because grief moved through the two girls in entirely different shapes, loud and restless in one, quiet and accommodating in the other, and Ruth, drowning in her own version of it, leaned on whichever daughter made that leaning easiest, without ever quite noticing which one that always turned out to be. By the time the twins were 7, the pattern had already hardened into something like family law, unspoken but absolute. When Margot broke curfew at 15, sneaking back through her bedroom window at 2 in the morning smelling of cigarettes she swore weren't hers, it was Eleanor who covered for her at breakfast, inventing a stomach flu that had supposedly kept Margot up half the night, standing at the stove with her back to her mother so Ruth would not see her face while she lied, because Eleanor understood, even at 15, that her sister's mistakes landed on the whole family in a way her own quiet obedience never had to be tested against. There was a night, the same year, when Margot came home past midnight after a party Ruth had explicitly forbidden her from attending, and found Eleanor still awake in the bedroom they shared, sitting cross-legged on her own bed with a book she wasn't really reading, waiting. Margot had climbed through the window smelling of someone else's cologne and cheap beer, and instead of the argument she braced herself for, she found her sister already holding out a stick of gum and a plausible excuse for the morning, already rehearsing the story they would need if their mother asked why Margot's light had been on so late. Margot had hugged her that night, fierce and grateful, and said, half laughing, half serious, that she didn't know what she'd do without her. And Eleanor, 16 years old and already tired in a way she did not yet have words for, had said only that she knew, and had turned off the lamp, and had not slept for a long while afterward, staring at the ceiling, wondering, in the specific quiet way she wondered most things, what it might feel like to be the one who got covered for instead. When Margot's first serious boyfriend broke her heart in the cruelest possible way, publicly, at a school dance, in front of nearly everyone they knew, it was Eleanor who sat with her on the bathroom floor until 2 in the morning, missing her own date entirely, without once being asked whether she minded, because asking Eleanor whether she minded had simply never occurred to anyone in that house, including, for a long time, Eleanor herself. She remembered handing her sister paper towels to blot her mascara, remembered the specific ache of her own dress, chosen carefully for a boy who was, at that very moment, waiting for her at a dance she would never make it back to, remembered thinking, distantly, underneath the immediate concern for her sister, that there was a version of that same evening where someone was sitting on a bathroom floor for her, and that she could not, for the life of her, picture who that person would have been. Ruth was not a cruel mother, and it would be unfair to remember her as one. She loved both her daughters completely, in the specific, imperfect way most mothers love children they are still learning how to raise, even as those children grow old enough to notice the unevenness of it. There were nights Ruth sat at the edge of Eleanor's bed simply to tell her she was proud of her. Nights she meant every word of it completely. And it was only much later, far too late to undo any of it, that Ruth understood the particular cruelty of praising a child only for the way she made herself unnecessary to worry about. But there is a particular kind of guilt that settles into a parent late in life, quietly, almost without her permission, the guilt of realizing that one child was allowed to need things loudly for 30 years while the other was quietly trained to need nothing at all. And by the time Ruth recognized what she had done, her daughters were grown women with husbands and children of their own, and the pattern she had built without meaning to had long since built itself into the architecture of who they both were. Before we continue, let us know in the comments whether you grew up as the sibling everyone counted on, and whether anyone ever thought to ask what you needed in return. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss anything that happens next. Margot married young, and married well, in the specific way people mean when they use that phrase, which is to say she married a man named Whitfield Calloway III, a man whose family had been quietly wealthy for 3 generations, whose mother Patricia had a way of looking at people that made them feel priced before they had said a single word. Whit had met Margot at a charity fundraiser their senior year of college. Drawn immediately, he told people for years afterward, to the particular way she filled a room without ever seeming to try. And Margot, who had spent her entire childhood being the loudest and most looked at person in any space she occupied, had found in Whit's steady, moneyed admiration something that felt, for the first time, like being chosen rather than merely tolerated. The wedding had been the kind of event photographed for the local society pages, white tints stretched across the Calloway estate, string quartets, a dress that had taken 4 fittings to get exactly right, 300 guests seated at tables arranged around a fountain that had been installed specifically for the occasion and removed the following week. Eleanor had stood beside her sister that day in a bridesmaid's gown the color of pale champagne, genuinely happy for her, and also, quietly, in a place she did not examine too closely, aware of the specific shape of the life Margot was stepping into, a life built on appearances that would need constant tending, though none of them understood yet exactly how much tending it would eventually require. Patricia Calloway had approached Eleanor once during the reception, champagne flute in hand, and remarked, with the particular mildness she used for observations that were never actually mild, that it was a shame Eleanor hadn't found herself a man of Wit's caliber, that surely there were opportunities she simply hadn't pursued, and Eleanor had smiled the way she had learned to smile at comments like that one, and had said only that she was very happy with the life she had, and had walked away, before Patricia could see whether she meant it. Eleanor married 2 years later, in a small ceremony in her mother's backyard, to a man named Daniel Reyes who worked as a high school shop teacher and who had never once, in all the years Eleanor had known him, made her feel like she needed to be smaller or louder or different than she already was. He had proposed to her in a hardware store parking lot, of all places, on an ordinary Saturday afternoon, while they were picking up supplies for a bookshelf he was building her, dropping to one knee between 2 shopping carts with a ring he had been carrying in his jacket pocket for 3 weeks, waiting for a moment that felt right rather than a moment that felt impressive, and Eleanor had laughed and cried at the same time, right there in the parking lot, in a way she rarely let herself do in front of anyone. There were no photographers at Eleanor's wedding. There was a borrowed sound system that skipped twice during the first dance, and a cake Ruth had baked herself because the caterer Eleanor originally wanted had been booked for another wedding that same weekend, a wedding, as it happened, considerably larger than Eleanor's own. Margot had come, of course, standing beside her sister as maid of honor, genuinely tearful during the vows, and had leaned over afterward, during the reception, to whisper that she envied Eleanor a little, envied the plainness of it, the honesty, though she said it in the particular tone of someone who envies a thing she would never actually choose for herself, and Eleanor had laughed about it at the time, genuinely, without bitterness, because bitterness was not a language Eleanor had ever been taught to speak fluently. She simply noticed things. She always had. She simply rarely said out loud what she noticed. The years that followed settled into a rhythm that felt, from the outside, like the ordinary unfolding of 2 sisters' separate lives, but that carried underneath it the same old current, quiet and constant, pulling Eleanor toward her sisters needs the way water finds the lowest point in any room without needing to be told to. Margot called often, sometimes twice a week, sometimes late at night, when something had gone wrong at a dinner party, or with a contractor, or with Whit's mother, and Eleanor answered every time, because not answering had simply never occurred to her as an option worth considering. When Margot's first pregnancy ended in a devastating loss during her second trimester, the call came on a Tuesday morning in early November, Margot's voice on the other end of the line so flattened by shock that for a moment Eleanor did not recognize it as her sister's at all. She remembered standing in her own kitchen, phone pressed hard against her ear, feeling the news land somewhere deep in her chest, even as her hands were already reaching for her car keys, already calculating how quickly she could get someone to cover her shift at the pharmacy counter where she worked 3 days a week. She drove 3 hours through a snowstorm to sit with her, the wipers barely keeping pace with the snow, both hands white-knuckled on the wheel the entire way, missing her own daughter's school recital to do it. A recital Nora had been rehearsing for 6 weeks, a fact Eleanor never once mentioned to anyone, including Daniel, until years later, long after it could have mattered to anyone but herself. She remembered sitting on the edge of Margot's bed that night, the curtains drawn against a world that felt, to her sister, suddenly and permanently unbearable, saying almost nothing, simply holding Margot's hand while she cried in a way Eleanor had rarely seen her cry before, without performance, without an audience, grief in its plainest and most unguarded form. Whit had hovered in the doorway that whole evening, useless in the specific way grieving men are sometimes useless, wanting badly to fix something that could not be fixed, and it was Eleanor, not Whit, who finally coaxed Margot into eating something small, who finally got her to sleep sometime after midnight, who sat alone afterward in the Calloway kitchen drinking cold coffee and wondering, distantly, who might make that same 3-hour drive for her, if the circumstances were ever reversed. Nora had asked about the missed recital for weeks afterward. In the plane, wounded way children ask about things they don't yet have language to be properly hurt by, and Eleanor had told her only that Aunt Margot needed her that week. The same explanation she had been giving her daughter, in one form or another, for years, an explanation that had always seemed sufficient before, and that, for the first time that particular November, had left Eleanor lying awake afterward wondering if it actually was. When Margot needed help planning a 40th birthday party for Whit that had to be, in her words, absolutely perfect, it was Eleanor who spent 6 unpaid weekends coordinating florists and caterers over the phone while running her own household of one husband, one 10-year-old daughter, and a part-time job that never quite covered everything it needed to cover. She remembered sitting at her own kitchen table late into the night with a legal pad covered in vendor names and delivery windows, Daniel occasionally passing behind her chair to rub her shoulders and ask, gently, whether Margot had any idea how much of this Eleanor was actually doing for her, and Eleanor telling him, every time, that it was fine, that Margot was simply overwhelmed, that this was just what sisters did for each other, though she noticed, even as she said it, that the sentence never seemed to run in both directions. The party itself had gone beautifully, by every measure that mattered to the people attending it. A marquee tent lit gold against the evening sky, a band flown in from 2 states away. Whit genuinely moved to tears by a slideshow Eleanor had spent an entire weekend compiling from 3 decades of photographs. Margot had thanked her that night in front of the whole party, raising a glass to her sister with real gratitude in her voice, and Eleanor had smiled and accepted the toast the way she always did, gracefully, without complaint, while some small, quiet part of her noted that no one at that party, including her own sister, seemed to know exactly how many hours had gone into building an evening they would all remember as effortless. Nora, Eleanor's daughter, was 10 years old that spring, sharp-eyed in the particular way only children raised by exhausted, careful mothers tend to be, the kind of child who notices when the air in a room changes before any adult in that room has said a single word to explain why. She had grown up watching her mother answer Aunt Margot's calls at every hour of the day and night, had grown up hearing the specific, softer voice her mother used only for those calls, gentler and more accommodating than the voice she used for anyone else, including, Nora had noticed more than once, including Nora's own father. She had asked her mother once, with the blunt honesty only a child that age can manage without meaning any particular cruelty by it, why Aunt Margot got to need things and Mom never did, and Eleanor had laughed the question off in the moment. The way she laughed off most things that landed too close to a truth she wasn't ready to sit inside of, though she had thought about that question, unexpectedly, at odd hours for weeks afterward. It was on an ordinary Tuesday evening in early spring, the kind of evening that gives no warning at all of what it is about to set in motion, with rain tapping lightly against the kitchen window, and a pot of pasta water just beginning to hiss on the stove, that Margot called Eleanor with a request that sounded, at first, almost identical to 100 requests that had come before it. There was a gala, Margot explained, her voice coming quick and slightly breathless the way it always did when she needed something and had already decided, before the conversation even began, that she would find a way to get it. A fundraiser Whit was hosting for the Calloway Family Foundation, an event that mattered enormously to Whit's mother Patricia, and Margot needed, just for one day, to be somewhere else entirely, somewhere she was not yet willing to name, and she needed Eleanor, her identical twin sister, the one person in the entire world who could pass convincingly as her, to stand in her place at that gala until she returned. Eleanor asked, at first, the ordinary questions a sister asks. Where exactly are you going? Why can't you simply tell with the truth and let the gala happen without you for once in your life? Margot's answers came quickly, a little too quickly, wrapped in the particular breathless urgency she always used when she needed something and did not want to be examined too closely about why. Something about an old friend in crisis, something vague enough to discourage further questions without being specific enough to actually satisfy any of them. And Eleanor, listening to her sister's voice go thin and pleading over the phone, felt the same old current pulling at her before she had even consciously decided to give in to it. Behind her, the pasta water had begun to boil over, hissing against the burner, and she reached to turn it down with her free hand without ever once considering that the answer she was about to give might be worth pausing over. Before we continue any further into the story of what that one day would eventually cost both sisters, let us know in the comments if you've ever felt like the one everyone in your family could always count on, while wondering, quietly, who was ever counting on you. And if you haven't already, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss anything that happens next. Daniel had come into the kitchen partway through the call, drying his hands on a dish towel, and had caught only the tail end of it, enough to understand, from the particular shape of his wife's voice, exactly which sister was on the other end of the line. He said nothing while she finished the call, simply stood by the counter waiting, and it was only after Eleanor had hung up, already reaching for the overnight bag in the hall closet, that he asked her the question that would matter more than either of them yet understood. He asked her, standing in the kitchen doorway that night while she packed, his voice careful in the specific way he only used when he was choosing not to say what he really meant, when the last time was that she had done something simply for herself, rather than for Margot. Eleanor had laughed the question off the way she laughed off most things that came too close to a truth she was not ready to sit inside of, folding a blouse that was not even hers into a bag she had borrowed for the occasion, telling him it was only one day, only 24 hours, and that surely one day of helping her sister was not going to cost either of them very much at all. Daniel had not pushed the question further, though he had lingered in the doorway a moment longer than the conversation strictly required, watching his wife fold clothes that belonged to someone else with the same careful attention she gave everything, and had finally said only that he hoped, for her sake, that this was the last favor of its kind, before going back downstairs to check on the pasta. She had no way of knowing yet, standing in her own bedroom folding borrowed clothes into a borrowed bag, that by the time those 24 hours were finished, she would understand her sister, her mother, her own marriage, and herself more completely, and more painfully, than she had in the entire 34 years that came before it. The morning of the switch arrived gray and unremarkable, the kind of ordinary daylight that gives no indication whatsoever of the particular day it is about to become. Low clouds sitting flat against the sky the way they do in early spring before anyone can quite decide if the season has actually turned yet. Eleanor had left her own house before 6, kissing Nora's forehead while she still slept, leaving Daniel a note on the counter beside the coffee maker that said only that she'd call that evening, that she loved him, that she'd explain everything properly once this was over. She stood in her sister's dressing room 3 hours before the gala was set to begin, watching a hairstylist named Ines work a curling iron through hair that was, strand for strand, identical to her own, and yet somehow required an entirely different vocabulary to describe once it belonged to Margot. Ines chattered the way stylists often do, filling silence out of habit rather than necessity, remarking twice on how strange it was, even after knowing both sisters for years, how completely one could disappear into the other with the right clothes and the right light. She held up 2 shades of lipstick against Eleanor's wrist, deciding between them out loud without waiting for an answer, and mentioned, almost in passing, that Mrs. Calloway had seemed a little quiet lately, though Ines couldn't say exactly why, and Eleanor, sitting very still under the older woman's hands, filed that comment away without knowing yet how much it would come to matter. Margot had left before dawn, slipping out through the side entrance of the estate with a single small bag, and an expression Eleanor had only seen on her sister's face a handful of times in 34 years, an expression that mixed urgency, with something closer to fear than Eleanor had time to examine before Margot was already gone, already down the long gravel drive, already turning out of sight around the hedge line that separated the Calloway estate from the rest of the world. She had left behind only the barest outline of an explanation, a hand on Eleanor's arm and a promise, murmured quickly in the dark of the front hallway, that she would explain everything the moment she returned, that this was not the kind of thing she could say out loud yet, not even to Eleanor, not even to the one person who had spent her entire life being trusted with everything Margot could not carry alone. "Look at me," Margot had said, gripping her sister's wrist a little too tightly. 24 hours. That's all I need. I will make this up to you, I promise. And Eleanor had nodded, the way she always nodded, and had not asked the one question that might have changed everything that followed, which was simply why her sister's hands were shaking. Patricia Calloway found Eleanor in the drawing room an hour before the first guests arrived, moving through the space the way she moved through every space she had ever occupied, with the unhurried certainty of a woman who has never once doubted her right to evaluate a room and everyone standing inside it. She wore charcoal gray that evening, the color she wore to nearly everything, and carried herself with the particular stillness of someone who had long ago decided that raising her voice was beneath her. That quiet, precise cruelty accomplished far more than volume ever could. She looked at Eleanor for a long moment before speaking, longer than politeness required, her eyes moving from Eleanor's face to her hands and back again, the way a jeweler examines a stone she suspects might not be what it was represented to be. "You seem different today," Patricia said finally, in the mild, precise voice she used for observations she intended as accusations, tilting her head slightly, waiting. Eleanor answered the way Margot might have answered, with a small laugh and a comment about nerves over the guest list, mentioning the caterer's confusion over the vegetarian count, a detail plausible enough to pass, and Patricia's expression did not change at all, which somehow felt worse than if it had. She simply studied Eleanor a moment longer, said that nerves didn't suit a Calloway wife, and moved on toward the terrace doors without waiting for a response, leaving Eleanor standing alone in the drawing room with her heart beating harder than the exchange should reasonably have warranted. The gala unfolded exactly the way galas of that kind always unfold. String lights strung low across the lawn as the afternoon faded into evening, a quartet playing something classical and forgettable near the terrace doors, waiters circulating with trays of champagne and small, architectural appetizers that seemed designed more to be photographed than eaten, guests in expensive, careful clothing drifting from conversation to conversation with the practiced ease of people who had attended 100 evenings just like this one and would attend 100 more before they were finished. Eleanor moved through it all as her sister, complimenting dresses she did not recognize, laughing at jokes she had not heard the beginning of, answering to a name that was not hers with an ease that frightened her slightly, the specific ease of a woman who has spent her entire life making herself fit whatever shape was required of her in any given room. She caught her own reflection once, in the glass of the terrace doors as the sky darkened behind her, and for one disorienting moment did not recognize the woman looking back, dressed in Margot's clothes, standing in Margot's garden, smiling Margot's practiced smile at strangers who had no idea they were speaking to the wrong twin entirely. It was Whit who pulled her aside near the far end of the terrace, just past the reach of the string lights, his hand light on her elbow, his voice pitched low in the particular register men use when they believe they are finally alone with their own wives. The air out there had gone cooler, carrying the faint smell of cut grass and the distant sound of the quartet still playing behind them, and it was there, in that half-lit corner of a lawn belonging to a family that was not her own, that Eleanor first heard something in her brother-in-law's voice she had never heard directed at Margot before, an urgency underneath his usual composure. a need for reassurance rather than the effortless confidence he wore in every room Eleanor had ever seen him occupy. "I need you on board before the quarter closes," he said, glancing back toward the house as though checking whether anyone could overhear him, his jaw tight in a way that made him look, for a moment, considerably younger than his 40 years. "The money's only a problem if you make it one," he added, his voice dropping further, "if you start asking questions at the wrong moment in front of the wrong people." And Eleanor, playing a role she had never rehearsed for a scene like this one, said only what she thought her sister might say. Careful, non-committal words meant to buy time rather than answer a question she did not yet understand the shape of. Something about trusting him to handle it. Something vague enough to satisfy a man who badly wanted to be satisfied. Whit exhaled, visibly relieved, and reached for her hand the way a man reaches for reassurance rather than affection. And Eleanor let him take it, standing very still in the dark, feeling the full, strange weight of holding a hand that believed it belonged to someone else entirely. The message did not name itself as anything more than 3 lines of text, but 3 lines were enough, more than enough, to rearrange everything Eleanor believed about her sister's marriage in the space of a single breath. She read it standing perfectly still, one hand braced against the cool marble edge of the counter. And for a long moment the only sound in that enormous kitchen was the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant, muffled laughter of guests still lingering somewhere out on the lawn, unaware that the woman they had spent all evening believing was Margot Calloway was standing 30 feet away from them, quietly falling apart. Her first instinct, the one that had governed nearly every decision of her adult life, was to protect her sister from what this would look like if anyone else ever found it. She locked the phone. She set it down exactly where she had found it, face down, as though hiding the screen might somehow undo what it had already shown her, and she stood there afterward with her arms wrapped around herself, breathing slowly, deliberately, the way a person breathes when they are trying to keep a single piece of information from showing on their face in a house full of people who are watching that face for any sign of a crack. She caught sight of her own reflection in the darkened kitchen window, Margot's earrings still catching the low light, and felt, for the first time all day, genuinely uncertain whose grief she was even standing inside of. 30 miles away, in a kitchen considerably smaller and considerably more familiar, the smell of garlic bread just beginning to catch at the edges under the broiler, Daniel Reyes was standing at the stove attempting, with limited success, to finish the dinner Eleanor had started before she left, a pot of red sauce simmering slightly too hot on a back burner he kept meaning to turn down. Nora sat at the table with her homework spread out in front of her, long division problems in a workbook she found tedious, her socked feet pulled up onto the seat of her chair exactly the way she had been told, more than once, not to do. The phone on the counter rang twice before Daniel answered it, wiping one hand on the dish towel tucked into his waistband, and the voice on the other end asked for Margot in a tone that was warm and familiar right up until the moment the caller realized his mistake, apologizing quickly, explaining he had meant to dial his wife's sister and had simply pressed the wrong name in his contacts. Sorry, wrong Voss," the man said, half laughing at himself, already moving to hang up, but not before Daniel had already caught the shape of what the man was actually asking about. Something involving numbers and a deadline, and a phrase that stuck with Daniel long after the call ended. The phrase "something feels off with her today." Daniel stood at the stove a moment longer than the sauce required, phone still warm in his hand, replaying the sentence. Nora looked up from her homework at her father's face and asked, in the plain, unguarded way only a 10-year-old can manage, why he looked like that, and Daniel told her it was nothing. The answer parents give children when they have not yet decided what the something actually is, though Nora, who had spent her whole short life reading rooms the way other children read books, did not entirely believe him. She went back to her long division, but Daniel noticed she kept glancing up at him every few minutes for the rest of the evening, the way she used to when she was much younger and afraid of thunderstorms. Back at the estate, Eleanor found herself cornered near the library doors by Patricia Calloway, who had a way of positioning herself in doorways that made leaving a conversation feel ruder than staying inside it. The hallway was dim there, lit only by a single wall sconce, and Patricia stood with a glass of something amber in one hand, watching Eleanor with the unhurried patience of a woman who had never once in her life needed to raise her voice to get what she wanted from a conversation. "I've watched enough marriages in this family come apart at the seams," Patricia said, her voice carrying none of its earlier mildness, to recognize the particular quiet that settles over a woman right before everyone else finds out what she has already known for months. She said it while looking directly at Eleanor with an expression that made clear she believed she was looking at her daughter-in-law, and that whatever was happening beneath the surface of this marriage, Patricia intended to protect the Calloway name long before she intended to protect anyone's feelings, including her own son's. "Whatever this is," she added, setting her glass down on the hall table with a small, precise click, "I would encourage you to remember exactly whose name is on that house." Eleanor answered without entirely meaning to, something quiet and unrehearsed rising up out of 34 years of watching her sister be underestimated by this particular woman. "Loyalty isn't about whose name is on a house," she said, her voice steadier than she expected it to be. "It's about who shows up when the house stops looking perfect." Patricia's expression shifted, briefly, something flickering behind her eyes that might have been surprise, or might have been the beginning of something closer to respect, the flicker of a woman encountering a version of her daughter-in-law she had not expected to meet that evening. She said nothing further, simply studied Eleanor a moment longer before turning and walking back toward the drawing room, her heels clicking evenly against the floor. It was well past midnight, the guests long gone, and the string lights switched off one strand at a time by staff moving quietly across the darkened lawn, when Margot finally returned, slipping back through the same side entrance she had left from that morning, her hair disheveled, her makeup long since worn away, her eyes rimmed with the particular exhaustion of a day that had clearly cost her more than she had let on. She stopped in the doorway when she saw Eleanor still sitting at the kitchen table, phone resting face down beside her, and something in her sister's stillness told Margot immediately that whatever had happened in that house today, it had happened without her being there to control it. And it was there, in the kitchen where Eleanor had been waiting for hours, that the two sisters finally stood face to face. Before we continue, let us know in the comments if you've ever had to hold someone else's secret while carrying the weight of your own unanswered questions. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what Margot says next. For a long moment, neither sister spoke. Margot stood just inside the doorway with her shoes still in one hand, having slipped them off somewhere near the car the way she always did when her feet had finally had enough, and Eleanor sat perfectly still at the kitchen table, the overhead light off, only the small glow from beneath the cabinets illuminating the space between them. Eleanor did not raise her voice. She had never once, in 34 years, raised her voice at her sister, and she did not begin that night, though something in her tone had changed enough that Margot noticed it immediately, the particular flatness of a woman who has spent an entire evening holding something together with both hands and has finally run out of strength to keep holding. "Who is R?" Eleanor asked, and the question landed in the quiet kitchen with none of the theatrics either sister might once have expected from a moment like this. No raised voice. No accusation dressed up as a question. Just four plain words, asked once, by a woman too tired to ask them any other way. She watched Margot's face do something Eleanor had never seen it do before. Not defensiveness, not the quick, practiced deflection Margot usually reached for when cornered, the deflection Eleanor had watched her perform 100 times across 3 decades, but something closer to grief, something that looked, for just a moment, like relief at finally being asked. Margot's shoes slid from her hand, and landed softly on the tile floor. She did not pick them up. She simply stood very still in the doorway of the kitchen, her overnight bag still hanging from one shoulder, and said the words that would carry this story into everything that came after them. "You don't know what you interrupted today, Eleanor. And I need you to trust me one more time before I can tell you why." Eleanor felt something in her chest tighten at the word again. The word "one more time." A phrase she had heard some version of for as long as she could remember. A phrase that had once meant everything and now, standing in this particular kitchen at this particular hour, meant something closer to a debt she was no longer certain she owed. She did not move from where she stood, and for a long moment the only thing filling the space between the two sisters was the low hum of the refrigerator and the sound of Margot's own breathing. Uneven now in a way Eleanor had rarely heard from a woman who had spent her whole life mastering the art of appearing composed. "Trust you about what? Exactly?" Eleanor asked again, more quietly this time, her voice carrying none of the old automatic softness it usually carried whenever Margot needed something. "I have spent this entire day being you," she continued, the words coming slower now, more deliberate, "wearing your clothes, answering to your name, holding your husband's hand while he told me things I don't think he meant for anyone but you to hear. I think I've earned an answer that isn't wrapped in one more please trust me." Margot flinched, almost imperceptibly, at the word earned, as though the accounting of the evening had finally been placed plainly on the table between them for the first time in either of their lives. She set her bag down on the counter with the careful, deliberate motion of someone buying herself a few extra seconds before she has to say something she has been avoiding saying for months, her hands lingering on the strap a moment longer than necessary. "It's Mom," Margot said finally, and the two words landed in that kitchen with a weight neither sister had expected them to carry. Eleanor felt the floor of her own anger shift beneath her, uncertain now which direction to brace against. She explained, haltingly at first, and then in a rush, the way people speak when a secret has finally outgrown the space they built to hold it, that Ruth had been diagnosed with a heart condition nearly 6 months earlier, a narrowing in one of the arteries that her cardiologist had described as manageable for now, provided she followed a careful schedule of monitoring, medication adjustments, and, if it worsened, a procedure that was not covered anywhere near completely by the modest insurance Ruth had carried since retiring from the school district. Margot said that their mother had made her promise, the very week of the diagnosis, not to tell Eleanor, because Eleanor already had enough to carry with Nora and Daniel and a job that never paid quite what it should, and because Ruth, in her own quiet, guilt-soaked way, could not bear the thought of becoming one more weight Eleanor had to shoulder without complaint. She said their mother's exact words, sitting in that first appointment, had been that Eleanor deserved one thing in her life that wasn't someone else's emergency, and that Margot, God help her, had actually agreed at the time, believing she was protecting her sister rather than simply repeating the same old pattern in a new disguise. The contact saved as a single letter, Margot explained, her voice cracking slightly for the first time all night, was Dr. Rayner, their mother's cardiologist, a man Margot had been in contact with for months, coordinating appointments, results, and the quiet, unglamorous work of paying for tests that insurance would not touch, using money she and Whit had set aside without telling him the full truth of where it was going, because she had been terrified, genuinely terrified, of what it would mean for their marriage if Whit understood exactly how much of their savings she had already moved without his knowledge. The message Eleanor had read that evening had nothing to do with any lover. It was Dr. Rayner confirming an appointment that could not wait, an appointment Margot had spent the entire day quietly attending on their mother's behalf, sitting beside Ruth in a waiting room 3 towns away while wearing her own clothes for the only hours of that entire day when she had actually been allowed to be herself. "I couldn't tell Whit the real reason I needed the day," Margot said, her voice dropping lower, "because that would mean telling him how much money is actually gone, and I couldn't tell you. because Mom made me promise, and I have spent 6 months being the only person who knows both halves of this, and today I just needed, for one single day, to not have to hold both halves alone." She looked up at Eleanor then, her eyes wet, her composure fully gone now in a way Eleanor had witnessed perhaps 3 times in 34 years. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm so sorry I let you walk into all of it without a single warning." Eleanor stood very still as her sister spoke, feeling something inside her chest loosen and tighten at almost the same moment. The particular vertigo of discovering that the story she had spent the last several hours quietly grieving had never been the true story at all. She thought of Whit's voice in the half-dark of the terrace, the fear underneath his composure, the plea for her to be on board before the quarter closed, and understood now that his anxiety had never been about betrayal in the way she had assumed, but about money disappearing from accounts he still believed he fully understood, money his wife had been quietly redirecting out of love and terror in equal measure. Unable to find the words to explain either one to the man she had built a life with. She crossed the kitchen then, closing the distance between them, and put her arms around her sister the way she had 1,000 times before, though something in the embrace felt different this time, less automatic, more chosen. "I'm scared too," Margot admitted quietly into her sister's shoulder. A sentence Eleanor could not remember her ever saying plainly before in all their years together. "I don't know how to tell Whit the truth without losing everything I built pretending none of this was hard." Before we continue, let us know in the comments if you've ever kept something hard back from someone you loved, believing you were protecting them, only to realize later how much that silence actually cost. And if this story has surprised you the way it surprised Eleanor, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss how it ends. The days that followed the gala did not resolve themselves quickly, and Eleanor did not pretend, even to herself, that one conversation in a borrowed kitchen could undo 34 years of an old, familiar pattern in a single night. She drove to her mother's house the very next morning, still faintly disoriented from a night that had rearranged nearly everything she believed, the drive itself feeling longer than usual. The radio left off the entire way, because she could not settle her thoughts enough to listen to anything at all. She found Ruth sitting at her kitchen table in her housecoat, a pill organizer open in front of her, sorting small colored tablets into the compartments marked with the days of the week, looking older and more fragile than Eleanor remembered her looking even a few weeks earlier. Ruth did not try to explain herself the way Margot had. She simply looked at her daughter for a long moment, setting down the pill organizer entirely, and said, in a voice thinner than Eleanor had ever heard her use, that she supposed it was time she stopped deciding for her daughters which truths they were strong enough to carry. "Sit down, Eleanor," she said, gesturing at the chair across from her, the one Eleanor had sat in for 34 years of ordinary mornings. "And let me finally say the thing I should have said years before your father ever got sick, let alone me." What followed was the conversation Eleanor had, in some quiet corner of herself, been waiting her entire life to have, though she had never once let herself imagine it might actually arrive. Ruth admitted, haltingly, painfully, that she had spent 30 years leaning on Eleanor's steadiness the way a person leans on a wall they have simply stopped noticing is holding up half the house, and that she had spent those same 30 years excusing Margot's recklessness because Margot's fear had always been louder, easier to see, easier to respond to, while Eleanor's fear, whatever it might have been across all those years, had simply never been loud enough to interrupt anyone. "I told myself I was protecting you by not asking too much of you," Ruth said, her hands folded tightly on the table in front of her. "But I think what I was actually doing was assuming you didn't need protecting at all, and there's a difference between those two things that I didn't understand until I was staring down a cardiologist telling me my own heart might not hold out much longer." She said she did not know, until this very illness had forced her hand, how deeply that unevenness had settled into both her daughters. One taught that her needs came first, The other taught that her worth lived entirely in how much she could carry without ever once needing to be carried herself. Eleanor cried in her mother's kitchen that morning in a way she had not allowed herself to cry in years, not the careful, contained tears she permitted herself in private, but something larger and messier, the grief of a woman finally being told, out loud, by the person who mattered most, that the imbalance she had lived inside her entire life had been seen after all, even if it had taken this long. Even if it had taken a heart condition and a stolen phone and a single misdirected text message to finally bring it into the light. Ruth reached across the table and took her daughter's hand, the same gesture Margot would repeat, unknowingly, in a kitchen of her own many months later, and said only that she was sorry, and that sorry was a small word for 30 years, but it was the only one she had, and she intended to spend whatever time she had left proving it meant something. It was Whit who came looking for Margot 2 days later, arriving unannounced at Eleanor and Daniel's modest house, standing in the doorway with none of the polished ease Eleanor had always associated with him, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, his voice smaller than she had ever heard it. He had not called ahead. He simply stood on the front step in the late afternoon light, looking for a moment like a man who had forgotten how to knock on an ordinary door. "Is she here?" he asked, and when Eleanor told him Margot had gone to sit with their mother that afternoon, he nodded slowly, seeming almost relieved to have a few more minutes before the conversation he had clearly come to have. He asked, plainly, whether Eleanor knew where the money had actually gone, and Eleanor, watching this careful, controlled man come slowly apart in her own front hallway, told him the truth, gently but completely, about Ruth's heart, about Margot's months of quiet terror, about a wife who had been so afraid of disappointing him that she had chosen secrecy over honesty, not out of malice, but out of a fear she had carried into their marriage long before either of them had ever met Eleanor's mother. Whit sat down on Eleanor's front steps that afternoon, in full view of the modest street he had never once visited before, and put his head in his hands, and admitted, more to himself than to Eleanor, that his own mother had raised him to believe money was the only language that ever told the truth, and that somewhere along the way he had let that belief convince him his wife owed him full and immediate access to every fear she carried, rather than the patience to let her come to him with it in her own time. "I kept thinking there was someone else," he admitted quietly, staring out at Eleanor's small front yard rather than at Eleanor herself. "I kept thinking that was the only explanation big enough for how far away she'd gotten. It never once occurred to me that she might just be trying to protect her mother from me finding out how bad things had gotten in our own accounts. It was not an excuse. Eleanor did not offer it as one. But it was, for the first time, an honest accounting, and honest accountings, she was beginning to understand, were the only kind of ground worth rebuilding a marriage or a family on at all. She sat down beside him on the step, not offering comfort so much as simply company, and told him only that the version of Margot who had been hiding all of this from him was not the version who wanted to keep hiding it any longer, and that whatever came next was going to depend far more on what he did in this moment than on anything that had already happened. Before we continue, let us know in the comments whether you believe people can genuinely change once they finally understand the cost of what they've been protecting instead of the people they claim to love. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss how the Voss family finds their way back to each other. Patricia Calloway did not soften easily, and Eleanor never expected her to. But when word reached her, weeks later, through Whit himself, of exactly what Margot had been quietly managing on her own for half a year, something in the older woman's posture changed in a way even Eleanor, watching from a careful distance, could not help but notice. Whit had told his mother the truth in pieces, over the course of several difficult conversations, and Patricia had listened each time with the same unreadable composure she brought to everything, though those who knew her best would later say she had gone unusually quiet in the days that followed, spending long afternoons alone in the very drawing room, where she had once cornered Eleanor with her pointed observations. Patricia visited Ruth once that spring, unannounced, carrying nothing more than a bouquet of grocery store flowers and an expression Eleanor had never once seen her wear at any gala. Something closer to humility than Eleanor would have believed the woman capable of showing. The two women sat together at Ruth's kitchen table for the better part of an hour, saying very little, though whatever passed between them in that silence seemed to matter more than anything either woman might have said out loud. Ruth mentioned afterward, almost in passing, that Patricia had apologized, in her own careful, indirect way, for the years of small comments about caliber and opportunity, and had said only that she hoped, going forward, both families might learn to measure each other by something other than appearances. Nora, watching all of this unfold from the particular vantage point only a 10-year-old occupies, the vantage point of a child who notices everything and is told very little, finally asked her mother one evening why Aunt Margot had needed to pretend to be someone else for even a single day. They were sitting on the edge of Nora's bed in the soft lamplight of an ordinary Tuesday, the same lamp Eleanor had read bedtime stories under for years, and Eleanor answered as honestly as she knew how, telling her daughter that sometimes the people we love carry things they are too frightened to say out loud, and that the bravest thing any of us can do is finally let someone else carry it with us instead of alone. Nora considered this for a long moment. In the serious, careful way she considered most things, picking at a loose thread on her quilt while she thought it through, and asked whether that meant her mother would never have to pretend to be someone else again. Eleanor pulled her daughter close and told her, in the most honest answer she had given anyone in weeks, that she certainly hoped not, that she was trying, very hard, to learn how to simply be herself, in her own kitchen, without needing to borrow anyone else's clothes to feel like she mattered. The following months unfolded the way real healing always does, slowly, unevenly, in small gestures rather than grand declarations. Margot began driving Ruth to every cardiology appointment herself, no longer hiding the visits from Whit, who now came along more often than not, sitting quietly in waiting rooms he had never once set foot in before, learning, slowly, what it meant to show up for a family that was not built on appearances at all. There were still hard nights, arguments that circled back to old fears neither of them had fully unlearned, moments where Whit's instinct to control every visible number in their finances collided with Margot's instinct to hide the ones she was ashamed of, but they were learning, gradually, to name those instincts out loud instead of acting on them in silence. Whit and Margot's marriage did not repair itself overnight, and Eleanor never once pretended, even to Nora, that it had. But something honest had entered it that had never fully existed there before, a willingness, however hesitant, to sit inside difficult conversations instead of managing around them. Margot began seeing a counselor on her own, something she would once have considered an admission of failure, and came away from those sessions describing, for the first time in her life, the particular exhaustion of being the twin everyone assumed could handle anything, a mirror, Eleanor realized with some surprise, of the very exhaustion she herself had carried for 34 years in the opposite direction. Eleanor's own marriage shifted too, quietly, in the months that followed, as she finally answered the question Daniel had asked her the night before the switch, the one about the last time she had done something simply for herself. She began saying no to requests she would once have said yes to instinctively, not out of anger toward her sister, but out of a slowly growing understanding that love did not require her disappearance in order to remain real. She signed up, that summer, for a Tuesday evening pottery class she had wanted to try for nearly a decade and had never once made time for, and Daniel drove her there himself the first night, waiting in the parking lot the entire 2 hours simply because he wanted to be the one to drive her home afterward. Daniel noticed the change before she ever named it out loud to him, the particular lightness that had crept back into his wife's voice, The sound of a woman who was finally allowing herself to take up as much space in her own life as she had always so generously given to everyone else's. He mentioned it to her once, quietly, over dinner, that she laughed differently now. Easier, less like she was managing the room, and more like she simply meant it. And Eleanor had reached across the table and taken his hand and said only that she was working on it, that some habits took longer to unlearn than others, but that she was trying. It was nearly a year later, on an ordinary Sunday afternoon in early spring, that the entire family gathered at Ruth's house for a birthday she had once quietly assumed she might not live to see. Her heart steadier now under careful management, her daughters seated on either side of her at a table crowded with mismatched chairs pulled in from 3 different houses. The kitchen smelled of the same roast chicken Ruth had made for every birthday for as long as either daughter could remember, and Nora sat at the far end of the table beside Whit, who had, in the past year, become a quiet, steady presence at these gatherings in a way none of them would have predicted 12 months earlier. Margot reached across the table at one point and took Eleanor's hand, without ceremony, without needing to explain the gesture, and Eleanor understood, watching her sister's face in the late afternoon light, that whatever imbalance had shaped the whole of their childhood together had not vanished entirely, because some patterns are too old to disappear completely, but that for the first time in 34 years, both sisters were finally standing on the same honest ground, carrying what they carried together instead of one carrying it silently for the both of them. Ruth watched her daughters that afternoon with an expression Eleanor would remember for the rest of her life. Something between gratitude and quiet grief for all the years it had taken to arrive at this particular table. And when she finally spoke, raising her glass in a toast that surprised everyone at the table, she said only that she was grateful, more grateful than she had words for, to have finally lived long enough to watch both her daughters learn how to need each other honestly, rather than simply needing one another to survive. Eleanor thought, watching the late afternoon light move across her mother's kitchen table, of the woman she had been 12 months earlier, standing in a kitchen that was not hers, holding a phone that was not hers, believing for one long, terrible night that she had discovered the worst thing her sister had ever hidden from her. She understood now, in a way she could not have understood then, that the truth had never been about betrayal at all. It had been about 2 sisters, raised unevenly by a mother who loved them both completely and imperfectly, finally learning, one difficult year later, exactly how to carry each other honestly instead of quietly, alone, in the dark. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments how it made you feel, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like Eleanor and Margot's.